Let's break down 8 players to stash before week 9 of the fantasy season. These are players that will be out there on the waiver wire in a majority of leagues that you guys want to get on your bench now because they could bring some upside to your roster as the season progresses. All right, let's kick the video off with Chamir Dike of the Tennessee Titans, a player that we talked about in a last week's stash video. He's moved up to 38% rostered, coming off of a game where he had 16.4 fantasy points, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 93 receiving yards. We've now seen him have 16.4 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. And what was nice about this past week is he got more involvement, 8 targets, 7 catches, like we said, compared to the previous week where he had just 4 total targets and found the end zone, which helped out his overall fantasy stat line. This past week, he really got you guys his fantasy points through receptions purely alone. And while this offense is still not good whatsoever, and Cam Ward is still struggling at the quarterback position, just like I said in last week's video, right? Bad offenses still produce good fantasy players at the end of the day, and this team is really looking for a true overall pass catcher. And sure, we could be looking at kind of like a splash in the pan here that could fade out with Chamir Dike, but ultimately right now, this is the only valuable wide receiver from a fantasy perspective. Sure, tight end Chicken Conquo pops up at times, and I mean, LKL Manor is still getting some sort of involvement. He did have 8 targets this past week. We have seen the backup tight end on this team, Gunnar Helm, get some involvement. He caught a touchdown this past week, but still, they are searching for a true wide receiver to get production out of in this offense, and Calvin Ridley is still dealing with that hamstring injury and is supposedly on the trade block. So Chamir Dike remains to me a player, especially in full PPR, that you guys want to go ahead and pick up right now while he's still this lowly rostered, because we saw just from week 7 to week 8, right, an increase in overall roster percentage, and now from week 8 to week 9, another increase in roster percentage. So go ahead, get him on your guys' benches right now if you need depth at the wide receiver position. I do think that there's a chance as the season progresses, this is a player that could bring some value to your guys' fantasy rosters. Next up, let's talk about Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers, who's moved up to 29% rostered, but got some nice involvement in week 8. 4 targets, 4 catches, 85 receiving yards, 12.5 fantasy points, and one thing that stood out to me, 21.2 yards per catch. We saw that big reception down the field to Christian Watson, and it's like, whoa, I mean, first of all, we weren't even sure if he was going to get any involvement in his first game active, and he was on the field for 56% of snaps, but then we saw a deep throw to Christian Watson. This is what Christian Watson brings to the table. This is how the Packers can utilize him. And ultimately, the Packers, the way this offense works overall, they're going to spread the football around to several different wide receivers, and Jaden Reed is getting closer to his potential return as well. We still have Matthew Golden looming around, and Romeo Doubs is still the clear number 1 wide receiver on this team. Clear number 1 pass catcher on this team is Tucker Kraft at the tight end position, but nonetheless, it was really nice to see Christian Watson get some involvement. Doesn't particularly have a great matchup this week, but bear in mind, the way Christian Watson's lining up on the field, he's not going to see opposing defense's number 1 corners, right? So I still think Watson could be a nice boomer bust flex option as the season progresses. Now, we have to go ahead and address the elephant in the room. He's already popping back up on the injury report. Questionable going into the week with a knee issue. So if you guys don't want to deal with this one, I can't blame you. We've been here before with Christian Watson. We've seen short-lived seasons. We've seen the injuries. We've seen that maybe he's nothing but a boomer bust flex play. But hey, the Packers are looking like one of the best overall teams in the NFL right now through the first 8 weeks of the season. So Christian Watson is going to be a part of this offense as long as he's healthy. If you guys want to take a risk, if you need some depth at the wide receiver position, I do believe Christian Watson is worth picking up as we approach week 9. Next up, let's talk about Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver Roman Wilson. He's coming off of a potential breakout game, 17.4 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 catches, 74 receiving yards, a touchdown, and 18.5 yards per catch. Outside of that on the season so far, 3.7 or less fantasy points, and we've seen some games where he's barely even got on the field. And it was kind of interesting here because we have seen Calvin Austin deal with some injuries. He missed both week 6 and 7, and we didn't really get anything out of Roman Wilson in those weeks. And this past week, Calvin Austin was back. He had 6 targets, 4 catches. But this is where we actually saw Roman Wilson make a difference. Now, he did find the end zone, did score a touchdown. If you take that away, obviously the stat line's not as good here, but he still had a solid game. And here in week 9, he's facing the Indianapolis Colts, one of the worst overall teams against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. So the potential is definitely here for Roman Wilson to get noticed by more of your guys' league mates, pop up on more like waiver wire content, all that stuff. If we see back-to-back double-digit performances, or even if he just scores a touchdown in week 9, I think that could be enough for him to be on the radar. It's a bit of a tough matchup in week 10 against the Chargers, but then he gets the Bengals, the Bills, the Ravens. I mean, there are some nice overall game scripts here, and the Steelers are right there in the hunt to be in competitive game scripts, as right now they're looking like one of the top teams to actually make the playoffs from their division. So it's a bit of a long shot here, but we are talking about long shots. We are talking about stashes in this video. Roman Wilson could certainly be worth picking up as we move into week 9 of the season. All right, let's move along to Bashard Smith of the Kansas City Chiefs, who had a nice week 7. We saw an uptick in volume. And then this past week in week 8, just 3 touches, 8 yards on the ground, 2.67 yards per carry, not even 1 fantasy point, and no work in the receiving game, which is what was giving Bashard Smith truthers some hope between weeks 4 and week 7, is that he had 3 or more catches and 3 or more targets in each of those 4 games. But nonetheless, here, the reason we're taking a look at Bashard Smith, who sits at 28% rostered, is because of that injury to Isaiah Pacheco, now dealing with a knee injury considered day-to-day. And some of the reports are indicating here that this could be a longer-term issue for Isaiah Pacheco. And while obviously Kareem Hunt is going to see some volume, just like we saw this past week with a rushing and receiving touchdown for Kareem Hunt, Bashard Smith is the next man up. And I think he's still ultimately more valuable to the pass catching element in terms of the Kansas City Chiefs running backs. And week 9 is going to be a really good spot for him because the Bills have not been good in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs, as you guys see on the screen. And this is going to be a competitive game script where I believe both teams are going to need to throw the football throughout the course of the game, and that could certainly lead to more involvement for Bashard Smith. So once again, this is one of those matchups that could put Bashard Smith higher on the radar in a lot of you guys' fantasy leagues, and ultimately be in line for more people out there in your fantasy leagues to potentially pick him up. So especially if we start to get wind that this Isaiah Pacheco injury is going to last longer. I know the Chiefs are on bye week in week 10, so we'll see how that affects things. But if we do get that overall news, then Bashard Smith is going to see an uptick in overall roster percentage. So go ahead, stash him now while you guys still can. All right, very quickly here, I want to run through 3 players who are all on bye week here in week 9 of the season. Let's start with Isaiah Davis. He was on last week's video, had a solid week 8, 17.9 fantasy points, 65 yards on the ground, 5 catches for 44 receiving yards against the Cincinnati Bengals. Is Breece Hall going to be traded? The reports aren't really indicating that, but Isaiah Davis, still a really nice handcuff to Breece Hall, is still getting the touches right now, and who knows when Braylon Allen is even going to return. So he's not going to help you guys in week 9. Maybe Breece Hall doesn't get traded, but Isaiah Davis sitting at 32% rostered is ultimately worth picking up. All right, Dylan Sampson also on bye week here in week 9, sitting at 19% rostered. And what we're looking at here is an injury to running back Quinshon Judkins, a shoulder issue. He's now considered day-to-day. And what we want to look at is in week 1, with no Quinshon Judkins on the field, Dylan Sampson had 8 targets, 8 catches, 64 receiving yards, and 17.3 fantasy points. Jerome Ford is obviously going to get some potential touches here, but supposedly he's also on the trade block. So Dylan Sampson, lowly rostered, has that nice receiving upside. That's why we liked him in the early terms of the season when we knew Quinshon Judkins wasn't going to be on the field, although Judkins did return sooner than some of us thought in week 2. Nonetheless, if Judkins misses time, I think that Dylan Sampson is the running back to own. And while he's on bye week here in week 9, get him on your roster right now if you guys are hurting at the running back position. And then let's take a look at Tank Bigsby Bigsby, who's 25% rostered, 10 fantasy points in week 8, 9 touches, 104 rushing yards on bye week in week 9 here, but we have an injury to Saquon Barkley dealing with a groin injury. Now, some reports are indicating that this is ultimately not that serious. Time will tell, but there is a potential for Barkley to miss some time or see a re-aggravation of this injury. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, they're playing the Giants, who have not been very good against a run this year, but still, Bigsby looked really good. I mean, 11.5 yards per carry, showed some burst in that matchup, had some nice runs. And this is going to be the next man up. I mean, maybe we see a world where A.J. Dillon gets involvement. He was a healthy scratch over the past week or two. Maybe they bring him in, make him active, all that stuff. But I think Bigsby maybe has proven here that he is the running back that the Eagles want to roll with if we do see Saquon Barkley miss some time. So if you guys are really hurting at the running back position, you need some depth, especially in deeper formats, Tank Bigsby is certainly worth rostering here in his week 9 bye week. All right, let's wrap it up with Colston Loveland of the Chicago Bears. 6.8 fantasy points in week 8, 5 targets, 3 catches, 38 receiving yards. We're certainly not looking at a crazy game this past week or anything, but what we do know is that Cole Kmet is still dealing with that back issue. Not sure if he's going to be able to suit up and play in week 9. And Colston Loveland is playing the Cincinnati Bengals, the team that's given up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends on the season so far. And, you think about Colston Loveland, this was a player that was drafted in a lot of fantasy drafts back in August, right? This was a rookie tight end that people had right next to fellow rookie tight end Tyler Warren. A lot of people believed in Colston Loveland being a potential weapon for this Bears offense in the 2025 season. That hasn't really shaped out, but maybe a potential breakout game could come here in week 9. And if he's going to do it, if it's going to be against any team, it's going to be against the Bengals. Undoubtedly, this team has been god-awful against tight ends all season long amongst other positions as well. But yeah, we could certainly see a nice stat line out of Colston Loveland in week 9. I know it's the tight end position. There's always streaming options, but some of you guys are in really deep formats, and Loveland could be out there and available. If you guys are hurting at tight end, if you need some help, maybe you're hurting at other positions and you can flex a tight end and there's nothing else out there, running back or wide receiver, he's certainly worth a stream here in week 9. But once again, if Cole Kmet continues to deal with this back issue, we could see an uptick in overall volume to Colston Loveland. So if you need help at tight end, he is worth stashing right now. And there you guys have it. There are my 8 players to stash before week 9 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever as we approach the week, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll answer as many of you guys as I can before Sunday. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously if you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our week 9 fantasy content. We have everything here on the channel that you could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.